"Dad, stop wasting my money on this garbage." Julian screamed, throwing the rare 1928 silver certificate into a busboy's bin right in the middle of the crowded, exclusive Oak Room Country Club. He pointed a manicured finger at his father's face, trembling with rage. "From tomorrow, your allowance is cut to 0. You stay in the basement, and you do not embarrass me again." Arthur looked at his son, then at his daughter-in-law, Chloe, who was smirking behind her crystal wine glass. Arthur did not say a single word. He simply walked away. But what Julian did not know was that the money he claimed his father was wasting was never his. It was Arthur's. All of it. The next morning, when Julian woke up to buy his new Porsche, he would find his bank accounts empty, his credit cards frozen, and his CEO title permanently revoked. And Arthur. He would be completely gone, leaving behind nothing but that crumpled vintage certificate. He is Arthur Sterling, and this is how he taught his ungrateful son the hardest lesson of his life. Only 10 minutes prior to that explosive outburst, the atmosphere at the Sterling table had been suffocatingly perfect. The crystal chandeliers of the Oak Room cast a warm, golden glow over the mahogany tables, highlighting the immense wealth of the Chicago elite who dined there. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved silently, pouring vintage champagne that cost more per bottle than a typical mortgage payment. They were gathered to celebrate the 10th birthday of Arthur's grandson, Leo. The boy sat between his parents, looking uncomfortable in a tailored suit that was far too stiff for a child his age. Surrounding them were Julian's business associates, hedge fund managers, and Chloe's socialite friends, all of whom measured a person's worth by the brand of their watch and the exclusivity of their zip code. Arthur sat quietly at the far end of the long table, intentionally making himself small. His own suit was decades old, the elbows worn thin and the lapels out of style. It was a stark contrast to the custom Italian silk Julian wore so proudly. Julian sat at the head of the table, laughing loudly at a crude joke made by a real estate developer, projecting the image of a man who owned the world. No one paid any attention to the quiet old man at the end of the table. To them, Arthur was just a relic, a pathetic dependent living off the success of his brilliant son. Chloe had even leaned over to whisper to the woman next to her, loud enough for Arthur to hear, complaining that they only let the old man live with them out of charity because he was becoming senile. The polite, uncomfortable chuckles from the guests felt like physical blows. Then, little Leo tugged gently on Arthur's sleeve. The boy's eyes were wide and innocent, the only pure thing in the room. He whispered, asking if his grandfather had brought the special gift they had talked about. Arthur smiled, feeling the familiar warmth crinkle around his eyes. He reached into the inner pocket of his worn jacket. His hand trembled slightly, not from the frailty of age, but from the weight of the memory attached to what he held. He pulled out a small, unassuming beige envelope. Inside was a 1928 silver certificate. It was a piece of history, part of a collection his late wife, Eleanor, had started before Leo was even born. It was not a toy. It was not a flashy gadget. It was a lesson in patience, a tangible piece of value meant to teach the boy that true worth grows slowly over time. Arthur handed the envelope to Leo, softly wishing him a happy birthday and telling him it was for his future. Leo's face lit up with a genuine smile, a rare sight in a household obsessed with appearances. But before the boy's fingers could even grasp the paper, Julian's hand shot across the table and snatched the envelope away. Julian held it up as if he had caught a diseased rat. He ripped it open, pulled out the vintage currency, and let out a short, cruel laugh. He announced the face value of the certificate loudly enough to ensure the entire dining room heard him. The polite conversations at the neighboring tables died down instantly. Julian sneered, asking his father if he was serious, reminding him that they were at the oak room where the tip for the valet cost more than the scrap of paper he was trying to give the boy. Arthur kept his voice low and steady, trying to explain the historical and sentimental value, trying to preserve whatever dignity he had left in front of his grandson. But Julian scoffed at the word value. He crushed the certificate in his fist, declaring that the $10,000 dinner he was paying for was real value. He called the gift an insult. He called his father a cheap old man who still thought it was 1970. And then, he threw the crumpled paper into the busboy's bin. It was in that exact moment, watching the piece of Eleanor's legacy discarded like trash, that the last fragile thread tethering Arthur to his son finally snapped. The heavy oak doors of the country club closed behind him, cutting off the faint sounds of clinking crystal and forced laughter. Arthur Sterling stepped out into the brutal, freezing embrace of the Chicago night. The wind howling off Lake Michigan was merciless, slicing through the thin, worn fabric of his old suit like a blade. Under the brightly lit portico, the valet, a young man bundled in a thick wool coat, took one look at Arthur's scuffed shoes and immediately looked past him, scanning the driveway for the next approaching luxury sedan. Julian's parting words echoed in Arthur's ears, a cruel and hollow decree from a son who believed he held the world in his manicured hands. He had told his father to wait for a cab, to scurry back to his basement cell, and to stay out of sight. But Arthur did not signal the valet, nor did he walk toward the taxi stand. Instead, he pulled his collar up against the biting cold, turned his back on the glowing warmth of the oak room, and began to walk. It was a grueling 10-mile trek to the Lake Forest estate, a journey no 68-year-old man should attempt in the dead of winter. The sidewalks were dusted with a fine, stinging snow, and the streetlights cast long, lonely shadows against the pavement. Yet, as Arthur walked, his stride did not falter. He did not shuffle like the broken, senile dependent his daughter-in-law loved to mock. He walked with the measured, deliberate cadence of a man who had spent 40 years pouring concrete, negotiating ruthless land acquisitions, and building a real estate empire from the ground up. The freezing temperature numbed his face and hands, but it also acted as a profound clarifying force. The bone-deep chill burned away the thick, suffocating fog of paternal denial that he had hidden behind for the past 5 years. He had spent half a decade making excuses for Julian's arrogance, telling himself that the boy just needed time to grow into the immense weight of the chief executive title, or that Chloe's toxic vanity was merely a phase. Tonight, the ice in the air froze those pathetic lies and shattered them. As the miles rolled by and the towering skyscrapers of the city skyline slowly gave way to the sprawling, dark estates of the northern suburbs, Arthur's mind drifted back to his late wife, Eleanor. She had always possessed a vision far sharper than his own. Where Arthur saw a son eager to succeed, Eleanor had seen a boy with a dangerously hollow soul. He remembered her lying in her hospice bed, her hands frail but her grip unyielding as she made and promised to protect the legacy they had built together. She had warned him that Julian loved the trappings of power but despised the grueling labor required to maintain it. She knew their son would surround himself with sycophants, that he would measure his worth in Italian silk and imported sports cars, and that he would eventually view his own father not as a mentor, but as an embarrassing liability. It was Eleanor's brilliant, paranoid foresight that had birthed the secret legal structure governing their vast fortune. Before she passed, she and Arthur had sat down with Vance, their fiercely loyal attorney, to draft a revocable living trust armed with a devastating fail-safe they called the Eleanor Protocol. Julian firmly believed he had inherited the empire the day Arthur stepped down and handed him the keys to the corner office. He believed he owned the Lake Forest mansion, the corporate accounts, and the limitless credit lines that fueled Chloe's insatiable spending habits. But Julian was merely a designated beneficiary living in a gilded cage built entirely of Arthur's continued goodwill. Arthur was the sole grantor of the trust, retaining the absolute, unquestionable power to revoke every single asset at a moment's notice, for any reason whatsoever. For 5 agonizing years, Arthur had endured the disrespect, the confinement to the damp basement, and the public humiliations, praying he would never have to pull the lever on the doomsday clause his wife had designed. He had desperately wanted to be wrong about his son. But the image of that crumpled 1928 silver certificate sitting in a restaurant trash bin played on a continuous loop in his mind, cementing his resolve. It was well past midnight when the towering wrought iron gates of the Lake Forest estate finally loomed out of the darkness. The sprawling, 10-bedroom mansion was an obscene monument to Julian's ego, featuring heated driveways and manicured, floodlit gardens that mocked the natural landscape. Arthur bypassed the grand main entrance, slipping quietly along the shadow cast by the towering perimeter wall. He walked past the expansive, climate-controlled garage where Julian's ridiculous fleet of luxury vehicles, including the Ferraris, the Range Rovers, and the brand-new Porsche, slept securely under velvet covers. Arthur moved like a ghost across the property he secretly owned, finally descending the narrow concrete stairwell around the back that led down to the servants' quarters. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into his room. The air inside smelled faintly of damp earth and neglected plumbing, which was a stark, deliberate contrast to the floral, perfumed air of the mansion above. The furniture consisted of cast-offs Julian and Chloe had discarded during their lavish redecorations. Arthur stood in the center of the cold, uninviting space, not bothering to reach for the light switch. He did not need the illumination to see the truth. He slowly unbuttoned his frozen coat, his mind completely clear, stripped of the last lingering shreds of hope he held for his son. The time for passive endurance had passed. It was time to wake the ghost. Arthur stood in the center of the damp, windowless basement, feeling the residual bite of the Chicago wind slowly fade from his bones, replaced by a cold, calculating heat. He did not bother turning on the single overhead bulb, perfectly memorizing the layout of the squalid room that had served as his prison for the last 5 years. Moving with a fluid, deliberate grace that completely belied his 68 years, he knelt beside the exposed foundation wall near the churning boiler. His calloused fingers found the familiar edge of a loose cinder block, pulling it free to reveal a dark, hollowed cavity. From the dusty recess, Arthur retrieved a heavy, weather-sealed case, blowing off a thin layer of grime before setting it carefully on his small cast-off desk. Inside the case was not a dusty ledger or a stash of emergency cash, but a state-of-the-art, encrypted satellite laptop that bypassed the estate's sprawling network entirely. It was a digital ghost, a direct lifeline to the true seat of his power, waiting silently for the day the founder finally decided to reclaim his throne. He flipped the lid open, the screen instantly glowing with an icy blue light that cast stark, unforgiving shadows across his weathered face. Arthur typed in a complex sequence of alphanumeric codes, watching as the secure terminal connected directly to a private server hosted in Zurich. He then reached back into the wall cavity and pulled out a prepaid burner phone, a device completely untraceable to anyone named Sterling. He dialed a sequence of numbers he knew by heart, pressing the phone to his ear and listening to the single, hollow ring before a gravelly voice answered on the other end. It was Vance, the brilliant, utterly ruthless attorney who had stood beside Arthur during corporate hostile takeovers and vicious union disputes over the past 4 decades. Vance did not ask why Arthur was calling at 2 in the morning, knowing his old friend would only utilize this specific channel that the absolute worst-case scenario had finally come to pass. Arthur simply stared at the blank concrete wall and spoke 3 devastating words, telling Vance to initiate the Eleanor Protocol. There was a brief pause on the line, followed by the faint sound of a heavy sigh and the clicking of a keyboard as Vance opened the sealed digital vault containing the trust's doomsday commands. Arthur's voice remained perfectly level as he issued the financial execution orders, systematically dismantling the empire Julian believed he owned. He instructed Vance to drain the company's operating capital, rerouting the payroll accounts and reserve funds into blind offshore trusts beyond the reach of any domestic court. Next, he ordered the immediate freezing of all personal assets, explicitly targeting Julian's executive checking accounts, the unlimited black cards Chloe used to fund her extravagant lifestyle, and the bloated savings they relied on for their constant luxury vacations. Arthur listened to the rapid typing on the other end, confirming that $12 million in liquid cash was evaporating from Chicago and rematerializing in impenetrable Cayman Island holdings. He wanted them left with absolutely nothing but the designer clothes on their backs and the loose change in the pockets of Julian's ruined Italian silk suits. But Arthur was not finished with the surgical demolition of his son's reality, knowing that financial ruin needed to be felt immediately in the physical world to truly shatter Julian's towering arrogance. He calmly instructed Vance to sever the estate's utilities, knowing the accounts were held solely in the name of the trust rather than Julian's personal name. Within hours, the power grid feeding the sprawling Lake Forest mansion would be remotely terminated, the heated driveway would turn to solid ice, the municipal water supply would be shut off at the main valve, and the backup generators would fail due to Arthur having physically severed their transfer switches earlier that evening. Vance confirmed that the eviction notices and the formal termination of Julian's chief executive title were already printing, ready to be served the moment the sun rose over the frozen lake. Arthur thanked his oldest friend, promising to reach out when he had reached a secure location, and quietly terminated the connection. With the digital tidal wave unleashed, Arthur closed the laptop, returning it to the hidden cavity and sliding the heavy cinder block perfectly back into place. He did not pack a suitcase, nor did he gather the meager, moth-eaten clothes Chloe had allowed him to keep, choosing instead to leave behind every physical reminder of his self-imposed martyrdom. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved the 1928 silver certificate he had carefully dug out of the Oak Room busboys bin before beginning his long walk home. He walked over to the narrow, unmade cot in a corner of the room, smoothing out the wrinkled, stained vintage currency with the palm of his hand, flattening the creases Julian had violently crushed. Arthur placed the artifact perfectly in the center of the thin pillow, a silent, damning accusation waiting to be discovered by the arrogant boy who had discarded it. Beside the vintage certificate, Arthur placed a single piece of heavy cardstock, pulling a silver pen from his breast pocket to write a final, permanent message to his son. He did not write a long, emotional letter explaining his heartbreak, nor did he hurl insults the way Julian had done so publicly at the restaurant. His handwriting was sharp and steady as he penned 5 simple words: "It was never your money." Arthur stared at the note for a long moment, feeling the last heavy chains of paternal obligation fall away from his shoulders, leaving behind only the cold, unyielding armor of the businessman he had resurrected. He turned his back on the damp basement cell, walked out the heavy wooden door, and slipped silently past the frost-covered luxury cars sitting dead in the driveway. Without looking back at the sprawling, doomed mansion, Arthur Sterling walked past the iron gates and vanished into the freezing, dark expanse of the Chicago night. The morning sun rose over the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan, casting a pale, unfeeling light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Lake Forest Mansion's master suite. Julian stirred beneath the weight of his imported Egyptian cotton duvet, his subconscious slowly registering a profound, unnatural stillness in the sprawling house. He reached out an arm, expecting the familiar, comforting wave of ambient warmth that usually permeated the multi-million-dollar estate. Instead, the air in the bedroom was biting, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of deep winter. Beside him, Chloe shivered violently, pulling the thick designer blankets up to her chin and complaining that the thermostat must be broken again. Julian groaned, rubbing his eyes and swinging his legs over the edge of the custom mattress, fully expecting his bare feet to meet the soothing warmth of the radiant heating coils installed beneath the imported Italian marble floor. The stone was like a block of solid ice, sending a jarring shock of cold straight up his spine and instantly fully waking him. Annoyance flared instantly in Julian's chest, a hot spark of entitlement protesting the minor inconvenience. He reached for the platinum intercom button on his nightstand, intending to bark at his father to haul himself out of the basement and fix whatever breaker had tripped in the utility room. He pressed the button, demanding service, but the system yielded only dead air, entirely devoid of the usual soft electronic hum. Grumbling about the sheer incompetence of the old man, Julian wrapped himself in a thick silk robe and marched out into the cavernous hallway. The oppressive silence of the house was absolute, unbroken by the usual gentle whir of the climate control systems or the faint hum of the industrial refrigerators in the chef's kitchen downstairs. He descended the sweeping, curved staircase, his breath forming small, white clouds in the freezing indoor air, heading straight for the $10,000 Italian espresso machine that was the cornerstone of his daily routine. He slapped the chrome power switch, fully expecting the machine to whir to life and begin grinding the imported beans he required every morning. The heavy chrome appliance remained completely dead, devoid of a single glowing indicator light or the hiss of building steam pressure. A few seconds later, a piercing shriek echoed from the second floor, shattering the frozen quiet of the estate. Julian bolted back toward the stairs, finding Chloe standing in the doorway of their massive en-suite bathroom, dripping wet and wrapped tightly in a plush towel. Her face was contorted in a mask of pure outrage as she screamed that the water had completely shut off right in the middle of her shower, leaving her freezing and covered in soap. Julian tried to calm her, insisting it was just a localized grid failure from the winter storm and promising to fix it immediately. He told her to pack a small overnight bag, declaring they would simply check into the penthouse suite at the Four Seasons downtown until the estate manager could resolve the pathetic infrastructure failure. He pulled his latest generation smartphone from the pocket of his robe, the screen lighting up brightly in the dim hallway, entirely oblivious to the fact that his entire empire had already evaporated. Julian navigated to his preferred luxury concierge application, confidently selecting the most expensive suite available and authorizing the transaction with the corporate black card linked directly to his executive profile. A small loading circle spun briefly on the glowing screen before a stark red error message appeared, boldly stating that the transaction had been declined due to insufficient funds and a suspended account status. Julian blinked, his perfectly manicured brow furrowing in deep confusion. He muttered that it had to be a banking error or a security hold triggered by the large, unexpected early morning charge. Refusing to entertain any other possibility, he closed the concierge application and opened his primary wealth management portal. The facial recognition software scanned his features, the screen unlocking to reveal the comprehensive dashboard of his financial universe. The numbers loaded onto the screen, and the blood instantly drained from Julian's face, leaving his skin the color of ash. He stared at the glowing digits, his mind violently rejecting the impossible reality displayed before him. The primary executive checking account, which usually held hundreds of thousands of dollars in liquid capital, read absolute zero. His personal savings account, the safety net he used to fund his extravagant impulse purchases, mirrored the checking account with another stark, terrifying zero. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at his throat as he frantically swiped to the next screen, desperate to see the comforting, massive sums of his investment portfolios and corporate reserves. The screen flashed another bright red warning, declaring that the portfolio was locked, access was completely denied, and the user must immediately contact the primary trust administrator. Chloe stepped closer, her anger faltering as she noticed the genuine, unadulterated terror radiating from her husband. She asked him what was wrong, her voice trembling slightly in the freezing air. Julian could not speak, his eyes wide and unblinking as the digital tidal wave of Arthur's vengeance washed over him, drowning his arrogance in a sea of absolute, paralyzing ruin. The paralyzing terror gripping Julian's chest rapidly morphed into a blinding, defensive rage. His mind, utterly incapable of processing the absolute zero balances displayed on his glowing screen, violently demanded a scapegoat. He convinced himself that this catastrophic financial freeze was some sort of archaic banking error, a glitch in a system that his father had somehow triggered through sheer technological incompetence. He turned away from Chloe, ignoring her frantic questions, and stormed down the sweeping marble staircase with heavy, punishing steps. He bypassed the cavernous, dead kitchen and marched straight toward the heavy wooden door that led down to the servants' quarters. Chloe hurried after him, her wet bare feet slapping against the freezing floors, wrapping her thick towel tighter around her shivering shoulders. She demanded to know what was happening, but Julian only shouted back that the useless old man had ruined everything again and needed to fix the power immediately. He threw his weight against the basement door, kicking it open so violently that the wood banged loudly against the concrete wall. Julian marched down the narrow cinder block stairwell, his voice echoing in the confined space as he barked Arthur's name, fully expecting to find his father cowering in the dark. But the basement offered only a profound, suffocating silence. Julian fumbled for the wall switch, slapping it repeatedly in a desperate frenzy, entirely forgetting that the estate's power grid had been completely severed. He relied instead on the harsh, artificial flashlight beam from his smartphone, sweeping the bright white light across the small, damp room. The beam illuminated the stark, depressing reality of the space they had forced the founder of their empire to inhabit for the last 5 years. Chloe stopped at the bottom of the stairs, her breath catching in her throat as she truly looked at the room for the very first time. It was essentially a dungeon, smelling of mildew and old dust, featuring exposed copper pipes that dripped condensation onto a floor of cracked, freezing linoleum. Julian ignored the bleak surroundings, his eyes darting frantically around the room as he searched for his father. He yanked open the doors of the small, uneven wardrobe in the corner, finding the flimsy wooden hangers completely bare. He pulled open the drawers of the battered bedside table, discovering them entirely stripped of Arthur's meager belongings, devoid of even a single straight button or scrap of paper. The chilling realization slowly crept into Julian's frantic mind that the old man had not simply wandered off into the winter night in a fit of senile confusion. This was a deliberate, meticulously executed vanishing act. The room had been scrubbed clean of Arthur's existence, leaving behind an empty tomb that echoed with the weight of their profound disrespect. Julian's flashlight beam finally swept over the narrow, unmade cot pushed against the far wall, illuminating the only items left behind in the desolate space. Resting perfectly in the center of the thin, flat pillow was the vintage 1928 silver certificate. Its edges were still slightly crumpled from where Julian had violently crushed it at the Oak Room, but it had been painstakingly smoothed out and laid flat like a sacred artifact. Right beside the piece of currency sat a heavy piece of cardstock. Julian slowly approached the cot, his hands trembling violently as he reached down and picked up the note. The ink was sharp and dark, forming 5 precise, devastating words that Arthur had written just hours before. Julian read the words out loud, his voice cracking in the freezing air, whispering that it was never your money. He stared at the note, his brain struggling to comprehend the absolute finality of the message, desperately clinging to the illusion of his own supreme authority. Refusing to accept defeat, Julian frantically unlocked his smartphone and dialed the exclusive, 24-hour platinum concierge number for his primary wealth management firm. He put the phone on speaker, the harsh ringing echoing off the damp concrete walls of the basement. A polished, distinctly corporate voice answered on the second ring, politely asking for the account holder's secure identification phrase. Julian barked his credentials into the receiver, screaming that he was the chief executive officer of Sterling Real Estate and demanding that his accounts be unfrozen that very second. He threatened to fire the entire banking staff and sue the institution for gross negligence. The representative paused, the sound of rapid typing filtering through the tiny speaker, before delivering a response completely devoid of any sympathy or fear. The voice calmly informed Julian that his beneficiary profile had been permanently flagged, his executive access had been completely revoked, and all liquid assets had been legally transferred to an offshore holding facility. Julian screamed into the phone, his face turning a dark, mottled red, demanding to know who possessed the authority to authorize such a massive, catastrophic transfer without his explicit signature. The representative did not hesitate, stating clearly that the transaction was executed directly by the primary grantor of the Eleanor Protocol Trust. Julian demanded to know what a grantor was, his voice rising in an octave of pure, unadulterated panic. The bank representative explained with chilling efficiency that Arthur Sterling was the sole creator and absolute dictator of the trust, holding the unquestionable legal right to revoke any and all privileges from any beneficiary who displayed gross misconduct. The representative concluded the call by formally advising Julian that he no longer held any legal standing with the institution and politely terminated the connection. The line went dead, leaving a hollow, the electronic dial tone filling the freezing basement. The phone slipped from Julian's trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the hard linoleum floor. The horrifying, inescapable truth finally sank its claws into his chest. He was not a king, he was not a chief executive, and he was not a billionaire. He was merely an evicted tenant standing in the dark, entirely at the mercy of the ghost he had created. The reality of his absolute isolation finally forced Julian out of the freezing, dead mansion and into the brutal Chicago winter. He had hastily thrown a heavy cashmere overcoat over a wrinkled dress shirt and suit trousers, sliding his bare feet into a pair of thin, imported Italian leather loafers that were designed strictly for carpeted boardrooms and chauffeured sedans. He had marched furiously toward the climate-controlled garage, intending to take the luxury SUV, but the massive security doors were sealed shut without power, and the electronic key fobs were completely unresponsive. His digital wallet was a graveyard of declined cards, meaning he could not even summon a ride-share or a private car service to transport him to the city. Driven by a blinding, manic desperation to reclaim his stolen kingdom, Julian did the only thing he could do. He started walking. The journey from the sprawling estates of the northern suburbs to the towering glass monoliths of the downtown financial district was an agonizing, multi-hour marathon of physical and psychological torment. The wind chill off Lake Michigan was merciless, slicing through his designer coat and freezing the angry sweat to his skin. Within the first 2 miles, the salt and dirty slush of the sidewalks had completely soaked through the thin soles of his expensive loafers, turning his feet into blocks of numb, aching ice. As the hours dragged on, massive blisters formed against the stiff leather, eventually bursting and soaking his socks with fresh blood. He tried to flag down passing vehicles, waving his arms frantically, but drivers only saw a disheveled, wild-eyed man wandering the freezing shoulder and sped up to avoid him. Julian was experiencing the city not from the elevated, insulated safety of a tinted town car, but from the brutal, unforgiving pavement that his father had poured decades ago. Every agonizing step chipped away at the polished veneer of the untouchable chief executive, reducing him to a shivering, desperate pedestrian. By the time the soaring glass facade of the Sterling Real Estate corporate headquarters finally came into view, Julian looked less like a billionaire and more like a man who had barely survived a shipwreck. His face was severely windburned, his perfectly styled hair was a chaotic, frozen mess, and his breath hitched in ragged, exhausted gasps. He limped heavily toward the revolving doors, leaving faint, rusty footprints of watered-down blood on the pristine pavement. He bulldozed his way into the expansive, climate-controlled lobby, the sudden rush of warm air making his frozen skin burn with painful intensity. The front desk receptionist, a young woman Julian routinely ignored or belittled for minor infractions, stood up in immediate alarm. She reached instinctively for the silent security alarm beneath her desk, failing to recognize the haggard, bleeding man stumbling toward her station. When Julian slammed his bruised hands onto the marble counter and barked her name, demanding she unlock the private executive elevators immediately, she stammered in shock. She quietly informed him that all of his access codes and biometric profiles had been permanently revoked by the legal department early that morning. Julian did not have the patience or the energy to argue with a subordinate. Unleashing a guttural scream of pure frustration, he shoved his way past the security turnstiles, utilizing brute force and the sheer element of surprise to bypass the shocked security guards. He threw himself into an open-service elevator before anyone could grab him, smashing his bleeding fist against the button for the top floor. His heart hammered against his ribs with a toxic, volatile mixture of physical exhaustion and righteous fury as the elevator rocketed upwards. The doors chimed open on the executive level, revealing the silent, thick-carpeted hallways that had served as his personal domain for the last 5 years. He limped furiously past the empty cubicles and the shocked expressions of the junior partners, heading straight for the massive corner office at the end of the corridor. He did not bother knocking. Julian threw his entire body weight against the heavy oak doors, bursting into the room like a violent storm. Vance, the ruthless, silver-haired attorney who had orchestrated the financial execution, was sitting calmly behind the massive mahogany desk. The lawyer was reviewing a thick file and leisurely sipping a cup of dark coffee, appearing completely unbothered by the dramatic, bloody entrance. Julian slammed his hands down on the polished wood of the desk, leaning forward and unleashing a torrent of unhinged demands. He screamed that Vance was going to reverse the illegal financial freeze that very second, demanding the immediate restoration of his corporate accounts, his credit lines, and his chief executive title. Spitting with rage, Julian swore that if his assets were not unlocked by the end of the hour, he was going to deploy a team of private investigators to hunt his father down, have him declared legally incompetent, and lock the old man inside a psychiatric asylum for the rest of his miserable life. Vance did not flinch, nor did he raise his voice to match the hysterical pitch of the bleeding, disheveled man standing before him. He simply removed his reading glasses, folded them deliberately, and placed them on top of the thick legal file resting on the mahogany desk. He looked at Julian not with the deference owed to a chief executive, but with the cold, clinical detachment of a mortician examining a particularly gruesome specimen. Without saying a single word, Vance reached into the top drawer of his desk, retrieved 2 single sheets of heavy watermarked paper, and slid them smoothly across the polished wood until they came to a rest just inches from Julian's bruised and trembling hands. Julian stared down at the documents, his manic ranting faltering as his eyes tried to focus on the bold legal headings printed at the top of the pages. The first was a formal notice of immediate termination, completely severing his position as the chief executive officer of Sterling Real Estate for gross misconduct and financial misappropriation. The second document was a court-ordered eviction notice, demanding that Julian and his wife vacate the Lake Forest mansion within 24 hours or face forceful removal by the county sheriff. Julian's mind short-circuited as he read the terrible words, his brain utterly incapable of processing the magnitude of the legal strike. He looked up at Vance, his voice dropping to a hoarse, disbelieving whisper, demanding to know how a retired old man living in a basement could possibly fire the owner of the company and evict him from his own home. Vance leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers together as he delivered the final, devastating blow to Julian's shattered reality. He explained in a calm, unwavering tone that Julian did not own the company, he did not own the sprawling estate, and he certainly did not own the millions of dollars he had spent over the last 5 years. Everything Julian possessed was entirely the property of a revocable living trust established by his late mother, Eleanor, and governed exclusively by his father. Vance detailed how Arthur had retained the absolute power as the sole grantor, possessing the legal right to revoke all privileges the moment the beneficiary proved himself unworthy of the family legacy. Julian shook his head frantically, spraying droplets of melted snow and sweat onto the pristine desk, arguing that he was the son and the rightful heir to the sterling empire. Vance corrected him with a voice like cracking ice, stating that being a son was merely a biological accident, while being an heir was a privilege that required profound respect. The attorney leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Julian with piercing intensity, and explained that Julian had permanently lost that privilege the exact moment he threw a priceless piece of Eleanor's legacy into a restaurant trash bin and publicly humiliated the man who had built his entire world. The realization that his public cruelty over a seemingly worthless piece of vintage currency had directly triggered his absolute ruin finally penetrated Julian's thick skull. The terror vanished, instantly replaced by a blinding, feral rage. He let out a guttural roar of pure hatred and lunged across the wide mahogany desk, his bleeding hands reaching violently for the attorney's throat, screaming that he was going to kill him for conspiring with the old man. Vance did not even bother to flinch or lean back to avoid the attack. Before Julian's fingers could even brush the fabric of the attorney's expensive suit, the heavy side door of the corner office burst open. Two massive men stepped into the room, moving with terrifying speed and absolute precision. They were former union enforcers Arthur had hired as private corporate security decades ago, men who were fiercely loyal to the founder and entirely indifferent to the spoiled son. One enforcer grabbed Julian by the collar of his ruined cashmere overcoat, while the other seized him by the belt of his trousers, lifting him bodily off the desk. Julian thrashed and kicked in the air like a petulant toddler, screaming obscenities and threatening to fire them, demanding they unhand the chief executive immediately. The enforcers completely ignored his hysterical threats, dragging him backward out of the corner office and into the pristine, thick-carpeted hallways of the executive level. The remaining employees, the junior partners and the executive assistants who had once cowered in daily fear of Julian's volatile temper, now stood in their open doorways, watching in stunned silence as their former boss was physically hauled toward the service elevators. Julian was dragged through the expansive, echoing lobby of the towering glass monolith, his ruined Italian loafers leaving a pathetic trail of scuff marks and dirty snow across the polished marble floors. The security guards at the front desk simply watched him go, having already received their explicit orders from the legal department early that morning. The enforcers pushed through the revolving glass doors and hurled Julian forward with tremendous force. He tumbled hard onto the freezing Chicago pavement, scraping his hands raw against the concrete and tearing the knees of his expensive suit trousers. He lay in the dirty slush of the gutter, gasping for air as the freezing wind whipped around him, while the towering glass doors of his former empire locked firmly behind him. Desperate and completely broken, Julian pushed himself up onto his knees, his hands shaking violently from the bitter cold and a fading adrenaline. He reached into the pocket of his torn overcoat and pulled out his latest generation smartphone, intending to call Chloe, to call the police, to call absolutely anyone who could save him from this nightmare. But as he raised the device, the glowing screen suddenly flickered, froze, and went entirely black. Miles above the freezing city, sitting in the luxurious, climate-controlled cabin of a private jet climbing rapidly above the dense winter clouds, Arthur Sterling looked down at the encrypted tablet resting in his lap. He watched the live security feed from the corporate lobby, seeing his son shivering in the gutter, staring helplessly at the permanently bricked piece of technology. Arthur had just executed the remote wipe command, severing Julian's final digital lifeline to the modern world. The trap was now fully closed, and the ghost of the basement was finally free. Julian pushed himself up from the freezing slush of the downtown pavement, cradling his scraped, bleeding hands against his chest. His bricked smartphone lay discarded in the gutter, completely useless, leaving him entirely severed from the digital network of his former life. The bitter Chicago wind whipped through his torn cashmere overcoat, punishing his exposed skin and forcing his panicked mind to seek an immediate survival strategy. He glanced down at his wrist, his eyes landing on the heavy, platinum timepiece that he had purchased to celebrate his 5th year as chief executive. It was a custom piece worth over $50,000, a status symbol he proudly flaunted at high society galas and corporate board meetings. Driven by the primal instinct to escape the freezing cold, Julian dragged himself down the block, eventually stumbling into a dimly lit, heavily graded pawn shop tucked away on a neglected side street. The pawnbroker, a hardened man who had seen every flavor of desperation, took one look at Julian's bruised face, torn suit, and manic eyes before casually examining the watch. Knowing Julian had absolutely no leverage and no other options, the broker offered him a mere $400 in crumpled cash. Julian felt a surge of bile rise in his throat at the sheer insult, but the trembling in his limbs forced his hand, and he accepted the pathetic stack of dirty bills. With a handful of cash, Julian managed to hail a battered city cab, instructing the driver to head north toward the suburbs to salvage whatever he could of his fractured life. He borrowed the driver's mobile phone to call Chloe, dialing the number from memory, only to learn that Vance had made good on his threats with terrifying speed. Chloe answered hysterically, screaming that county sheriffs had arrived at the Lake Forest estate an hour prior, forcefully escorting her off the property with nothing but the clothes on her back and a single leather handbag. She demanded he come get her, directing him to a decaying, run-down motel situated right off Interstate 90 where the cab driver eventually dropped him. The Starlight Motel was the kind of establishment where desperate people went when the world had decided it no longer wanted them, flanked by a roaring highway that smelled constantly of diesel fumes and burned rubber. Julian paid the driver almost half of his pawn shop cash just for the fare, using another $40 to secure a room key from the indifferent clerk behind the bulletproof glass of the front lobby. He walked slowly down the exterior concrete corridor, his ruined Italian loafers dragging heavily against the ground, until he reached room 104 and pushed open the flimsy wooden door. The atmosphere inside the motel room hit Julian like a physical blow, thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke, industrial-strength floor cleaner, and the metallic tang of absolute despair. The carpet was stained and sticky beneath his feet, while the sagging mattress was covered with thin, rough sheets that were a horrifying departure from the 600-thread count Egyptian cotton they were accustomed to. Chloe was standing by the barred window, staring out at the desolate parking lot through a gap in the cheap, yellowed curtains. She was still wearing the exquisite silk dress she had put on that morning, but in the harsh, flickering neon light bleeding through the window, it looked like a pathetic costume from a canceled stage play. Her tears had completely dried up hours ago, replaced by a cold, hard fury that seemed to radiate from her very bones. Julian slumped onto the edge of the sagging bed, burying his face in his raw, bleeding hands, whispering a desperate apology and promising that he would somehow fix the catastrophic mess. Chloe slowly turned away from the window, her expression entirely devoid of the practiced, loving warmth she had projected for the entirety of their marriage. She looked down at the shivering, broken man sitting on the stained bedspread and unleashed a vicious, verbal assault that cut far deeper than the freezing Chicago wind. Her voice was flat and cruel, echoing loudly in the cramped room as she called him utterly useless and pathetic, pointing out that he had allowed an old man living in a basement to systematically destroy their entire empire overnight. Julian tried to defend himself, his voice cracking as he reminded her that they were supposed to be a team, begging her to remember the love they shared. Chloe let out a harsh, ugly laugh that sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the room, her mask of devotion shattering completely into 1,000 jagged pieces. She mocked his delusion, declaring bluntly that love did not pay for room service and love certainly did not buy first-class tickets to Paris. She admitted with chilling casualness that their marriage was never built on affection, but was rather a calculated financial transaction where she provided the beautiful trophy wife and he provided the limitless billionaire lifestyle. She leaned closer, her eyes filled with absolute disgust, and whispered that he was never half the man his father was, surviving only because Arthur had permitted him to play pretend. The words hung heavily in the humid, foul air of the motel room, finalizing the total destruction of Julian's reality as he realized that without his father's money, he possessed absolutely nothing of value to anyone. Chloe did not just stop at verbal evisceration, wanting to ensure Julian understood precisely how completely she had outplayed him before she made her final exit. She turned her back on her shivering husband and walked over to the scratched, faux wood dresser where she had unceremoniously dumped her remaining designer handbag. Reaching deep inside the expensive leather, she bypassed her useless platinum credit cards and pulled out a cheap, plastic burner phone that looked entirely out of place in her perfectly manicured hands. Julian stared at the unfamiliar device, his red-rimmed eyes blinking in sluggish confusion as he asked her what she was doing. Chloe did not look at him, her thumbs flying across the small screen as she casually explained that she was booking a first-class ticket out of the freezing city. Julian protested, reminding her with a cracked, exhausted voice that his father had completely frozen all of their joint accounts and canceled every single credit line. Chloe stopped typing for a brief second, a cold, predatory smile spreading across her lips as she informed him that she was well aware of his absolute financial ruin, but clarified that she was absolutely not using his money to fund her escape. She turned fully to face him, holding the burner phone up like a twisted trophy, and revealed the secret she had kept hidden for the last 3 years. Every time Julian received a massive year-end executive bonus, every time he flipped a commercial property for a staggering profit, and every time he handed her a blank check to organize a lavish charity gala, she had quietly skimmed a generous percentage right off the top. Julian's mind flashed back to the countless times she had complained about her allowance, demanding more capital for imaginary expenses while secretly funneling his inheritance into a digital vault. He realized with sickening clarity that she had been planning to abandon him long before his father had initiated the financial freeze. She had always viewed him as a sinking ship, and she had spent the last 36 months quietly building her own lifeboat with his timber. She had meticulously laundered the stolen capital through shell corporations, eventually amassing a hidden nest egg of over $500,000 sitting safely in a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Julian listened to her confession in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of her prolonged deception. He asked her where she thought she was going, to which Chloe happily replied that her personal trainer was currently waiting for her at a luxury villa in Zurich, ready to start a new life funded by the very wealth Julian had blindly provided. She looked down at the glowing screen, entirely ready to initiate the international wire transfer that would purchase her freedom and leave her broken husband to rot in a $40 a night motel room. She pressed the confirmation button, her eyes bright with the anticipation of escaping the nightmare. But the satisfying chime of a completed transaction never came. Instead, the screen instantly flashed a brilliant, blinding red, displaying a stark error message that caused the triumphant smile to completely vanish from her beautiful face. Chloe frowned, tapping the glass aggressively with her fingernail, muttering that the offshore banking server must be experiencing a temporary connection timeout. She frantically re-entered her secure credentials and pressed the transfer button a second time, only to be met with the exact same glaring red warning blocking her access. The blood slowly drained from her cheeks as she read the small, uncompromising text beneath the error symbol, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper as she spoke the words aloud. The notification explicitly stated that the funds had been seized, the account permanently frozen, and the assets repatriated by the primary grantor of the Eleanor Protocol Trust. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, completely shattering her illusion of control. Arthur and his ruthless attorney Vance had not just locked the primary corporate accounts in Chicago. They had conducted a comprehensive, global forensic sweep of every single financial asset remotely connected to the Sterling name, uncovering her pathetic embezzlement scheme months ago. Arthur had simply let the account remain active, closely monitoring the deposits like a patient hunter, waiting for the perfect moment to spring the trap. He knew that true justice required Chloe to feel the intoxicating hope of escape right before the door was permanently slammed shut in her face. Julian watched her face pale, the crushing despair of his own ruin momentarily eclipsed by a dark, bitter sense of vindication. He let out a low, hollow laugh that echoed terribly against the damp cinder block walls of the motel room, pointing out that she was just as broke and powerless as he was. Chloe screamed in pure, unadulterated agony, curling the cheap burner phone against the wall and watching it shatter into a dozen useless plastic pieces. She fell to her knees on the sticky, stained carpet, tearing at her perfectly styled hair and weeping violently for the absolute loss of her $500,000 golden parachute. Julian looked down at his wife, seeing only a treacherous, greedy parasite who had drained his life just as thoroughly as he had drained his father. Trapped together in a filthy room with absolutely zero money, zero power, and zero avenues of escape, the last remaining illusions of their glamorous life together violently evaporated. They were left with nothing but their mutual hatred, circling each other in the dark like feral, starving animals locked inside a rusted cage, while the freezing Chicago winter pressed against the thin glass of the motel window, completely indifferent to the shattered remains of the Sterling dynasty. The suffocating silence in the Starlight motel room was heavy, pressing down on the couple like the tons of concrete and steel of the city they had just been exiled from. After Chloe's devastating breakdown over her seized offshore funds, the mutual hatred between husband and wife settled into a toxic, freezing stalemate. Julian sat on the edge of the sagging bed, his bruised hands resting on his knees, his mind racing through the terrifying reality of his absolute poverty. He possessed no home, no company, no credit, and a wife who openly despised him. The polished veneer of the chief executive had completely eroded, leaving behind something primal, ugly, and dangerously desperate. He knew with absolute certainty that he could not defeat his father or Vance in a legitimate courtroom, as the legal framework of the Eleanor Protocol Trust was completely impenetrable. If he attempted to file a lawsuit, he would starve in the gutter long before a judge even reviewed the preliminary motions. The realization birthed a dark, venomous idea in his fractured mind. If he could not win by the rules of law, he would simply have to rewrite them through brute force and criminality. Julian stood up from the bed, ignoring the throbbing pain in his blistered feet, and began to pace the narrow strip of sticky carpet. He spoke his plan aloud to the dimly lit room, his voice dropping to a harsh, conspiratorial whisper that made Chloe look up from her pathetic pile of shattered plastic. He declared that they needed a shortcut, a way to bypass the trust entirely by targeting the grantor directly. If they could locate the old man, they could drag him to an unprincipled medical professional and have him officially diagnosed as legally incompetent, citing his sudden disappearance and erratic financial behavior as proof of severe dementia. Once Arthur was heavily medicated and stripped of his cognitive authority, Julian could easily wrap the old man's hand around a pen and guide his signature onto a sweeping power of attorney document. With that single piece of paper, Julian could permanently reverse the financial freeze, fire the entire legal department, and lock his father inside a secure, high-walled psychiatric facility for the remainder of his natural life. It was a solid, malevolent strategy, but it relied entirely on locating a man who had effectively evaporated into the winter night. Julian walked over to the scratched dresser and picked up the motel room's cheap landline telephone. He dialed a local number from memory, reaching out to a disgraced former police detective named Russo. Julian had utilized Russo's services years ago to quietly bury a scandal involving a junior partner, knowing the investigator was completely devoid of moral boundaries and operated strictly on cash. When Russo answered with a gravelly grunt, Julian frantically explained the situation, promising the investigator an astronomical payout the very second the trust was reversed. He ordered Russo to check every private airfield, every luxury hotel, and every secure banking facility in the greater Chicago area, demanding that the investigator find the old man and physically hold him down until Julian could arrive. Russo agreed, but warned Julian that finding a billionaire who wanted to stay hidden was a nearly impossible task without a digital footprint. Julian slammed the heavy plastic receiver back onto the cradle, running his trembling hands through his tangled hair. Russo was entirely correct. Arthur had left his mobile device at the estate. He had no active credit cards in his own name, and his network of old Union contacts was fiercely loyal and impenetrable. The founder was a ghost, and ghosts could not be captured by chasing shadows. Chloe, who had been listening to the frantic phone call from the floor, let out a dry, humorless chuckle. She looked up at Julian with dead eyes and stated the obvious, pointing out that his father had blown up his entire universe over a single piece of vintage currency given to their 10-year-old son. She whispered that the old man only cared about one thing in the entire world, and that was the boy. The word struck Julian with the force of a physical blow, grinding against the rusted remnants of his morality. He realized instantly that Chloe was absolutely right. If Arthur believed his precious grandson was in danger, the old man would abandon his secure hiding place and come running straight into the trap. A chilling silence fell over the motel room as Julian processed the horrific magnitude of what he was about to do. He was actively planning to weaponize his own flesh and blood, to use a 10-year-old child as live bait in a dangerous extortion scheme. But the freezing draft seeping through the cracked window and the terrifying reality of his empty bank accounts quickly silenced any lingering paternal guilt. He convinced himself that it was a necessary evil, a temporary trauma required to restore the family to its rightful place at the top of the Chicago elite. Julian turned his back on his wife, his face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated ruthlessness. He grabbed his ruined cashmere overcoat from the chair, completely ignoring the painful blisters on his feet, and walked out the door into the freezing morning air. He was going to collect his son, and he was going to force the ghost to manifest. Julian walked away from the Starlight Motel, ignoring the agonizing pain radiating from the ruptured blisters on his freezing feet. He trudged a half-mile down the heavily salted shoulder of the interstate until he reached a discount auto rental facility. He slapped a portion of his dwindling pawn shop cash onto the scratched laminate counter, demanding the cheapest vehicle available that did not require a credit card deposit. The clerk handed him the keys to a battered, 10-year-old compact sedan that smelled overwhelmingly of stale coffee and cheap vanilla air freshener. Julian folded his tall frame into the cramped driver's seat, the cheap fabric a humiliating downgrade from the hand-stitched leather of the luxury vehicles he had lost just hours prior. He gripped the sticky steering wheel, his knuckles turning white, and directed the struggling vehicle back toward the city limits. His destination was not a bank or a law firm, but the heavily guarded campus of the elite private institution where his 10-year-old son was currently enrolled. He knew the legal bureaucracy surrounding the trust was a slow, lumbering beast. Vance had filed restraining orders and custody amendments, but those documents were likely still sitting and signed on a judge's desk. Legally, Julian was still the father, possessing the unquestionable right to retrieve his child. The sprawling stone architecture of the St. Jude Academy soon loomed into view, a fortress of extreme privilege nestled securely within the wealthiest zip code in Chicago. Julian knew better than to drive the battered rental car through the main security gates, where his disheveled appearance would instantly raise alarms. Instead, he navigated through the narrow residential side streets, parking the idling sedan along the far perimeter fence bordering the manicured recess yard. It was precisely 11 o'clock in the morning, the exact time the fourth-grade classes were released for their mid-morning break. Julian pressed his face against the freezing wrought iron bars, his manic eyes scanning the sea of children bundled in matching navy blue winter coats. He finally spotted Leo near the edge of the playground, quietly trading cards with a classmate, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic destruction of his family's empire. Julian whistled sharply, a specific, commanding tone he had always used to summon the boy. Leo looked up, his innocent face breaking into a bright smile as he recognized his father, completely unaware that he was looking at a monster. The boy jogged over to the tall iron fence, his breath pluming in the freezing air, happy to see his father outside of their usual rigid schedule. Julian did not offer a warm greeting. He reached his bruised, bleeding hands through the wide gaps in the ironwork, gripping the boy tightly by the shoulders of his expensive coat. Julian's voice was strained and frantic as he told Leo that there was a massive family emergency and they needed to leave that very second. He instructed the boy to climb up the decorative stonework at the base of the fence. Leo hesitated, looking back over his shoulder toward the playground monitors, citing the school rules about leaving early. Julian snapped at him, his temper flaring dangerously, ordering the child to obey him immediately. Frightened by the raw anger in his father's eyes, Leo scrambled up the stone base. Julian grabbed him by the waist, hauling the 10-year-old roughly over the pointed iron bars just as a teacher turned and shouted in alarm. Julian threw the terrified boy into the back seat of the compact car, slammed the door shut, and stomped on the accelerator, leaving the elite academy far behind before the security guards could even react. He drove erratically toward the desolate, industrial shoreline of Lake Michigan, seeking absolute isolation for the dark task ahead. The sky overhead was the color of bruised iron, matching the violent, churning gray waves that crashed aggressively against the ice-covered breakwaters. Julian finally pulled the sputtering vehicle into an abandoned winter boatyard, navigating through a maze of skeletal dry-docked yachts covered in heavy blue tarpaulins that flapped wildly in the bitter wind. The location was incredibly bleak, a freezing graveyard of summer luxuries that perfectly mirrored Julian's own internal ruin. He threw the transmission into park, leaving the weak heater running, and turned completely around in his seat to face his son. Leo was huddled in the corner of the cheap fabric bench, shivering violently, his wide eyes brimming with unshed tears. The boy asked in a small, trembling voice where his grandfather was and why they were hiding in such a scary place. Julian pulled a cheap prepaid smartphone from his overcoat pocket, a device he had purchased at a gas station along the highway. He stared at his son with a cold, calculating emptiness, utilizing the child's pure love for Arthur as a weapon. He told Leo a horrifying lie, stating that his grandfather had gone completely insane, that the old man's mind had broken under the pressure, and that he had run away into the freezing city alone. Julian lowered his voice to a dark, urgent whisper, telling the boy that if they did not find him immediately, Arthur was going to freeze to death in the snow. He placed the heavy burden of the old man's survival squarely onto the fragile shoulders of the 10-year-old. Julian raised the cheap camera, ordering his son to look directly into the lens. He commanded Leo to cry, to beg, to look as sad and desperate as humanly possible so that Arthur would see the message and come out of hiding. Leo did not need to act. The sheer terror of the situation and the overwhelming fear for his beloved grandfather broke the boy completely. Julian pressed the record button, capturing every agonizing second as Leo sobbed hysterically into the camera, tears streaming down his freezing cheeks, begging his grandfather to please come home because his daddy said he was sick. Julian stopped the recording with a dark, triumphant smirk, immediately forwarding the digital hostage file directly to Vance's secure corporate email server, knowing the attorney would instantly relay the devastating bait to the ghost watching from the shadows. 1,000 miles away from the freezing shoreline of Lake Michigan, Arthur Sterling sat in the cavernous great room of his secure Wyoming compound. The rustic timber lodge was surrounded by hundreds of acres of impenetrable, snow-covered wilderness, serving as the perfect, untraceable fortress for a man who had just erased his own existence. A massive stone fireplace crackled warmly, casting a steady, golden light across the polished oak floorboards, completely insulated from the biting winter winds howling outside the reinforced glass windows. Arthur rested in a heavy leather armchair, nursing a glass of 20-year-old scotch, his mind quietly calculating the inevitable trajectory of his son's rapid descent. He knew Julian would panic, he knew Julian would lash out, and he knew Julian would ultimately attempt to locate him. What Arthur had not fully anticipated was the sheer, grotesque depths to which his son would sink to reclaim his stolen wealth. The secure satellite terminal resting on the side table emitted a sharp, encrypted chime, signaling an incoming high-priority transmission from Vance. Arthur set his glass down, his calloused fingers opening the digital file that would irrevocably seal Julian's fate. The screen illuminated with the grainy, unstable footage of the hostage video, shot from the low angle of a cheap prepaid smartphone camera. Arthur stared at the high-definition display, his jaw tightening into a hard, unforgiving line as the terrified image of his 10-year-old grandson filled the frame. He watched Leo shivering violently in the back seat of a strange vehicle, his small face stained with tears and contorted in genuine, unadulterated fear. He listened to the boy sob, begging his grandfather to come out of hiding because his father had told him the old man was sick and freezing to death. The emotional sting of seeing the innocent child in such profound distress flared briefly in Arthur's chest, a sharp pang of protective fury that threatened to shatter his carefully composed exterior. He could hear Julian's muffled, manipulative voice off camera, directing the boy's terror like a sociopathic stage manager orchestrating a tragedy. But Arthur did not panic, nor did he let the righteous anger override his meticulous preparation. Panic was a luxury reserved entirely for the weak, and Arthur Sterling was the undisputed architect of this entire theater. He closed the video file, the cruel lie of the sick, helpless grandfather echoing in the quiet lodge, and immediately opened a specialized tactical tracking application on the secure terminal. Julian firmly believed he had outsmarted the trust by utilizing untraceable cash and a discount auto rental, completely unaware that he had been under constant, invisible surveillance since the very second he hit the pavement outside the corporate headquarters. Arthur's elite private security operatives had shadowed the ruined chief executive to the pawn shop, followed him to the squalid motel, and smoothly attached a microscopic, military-grade global positioning tracker to the undercarriage of the battered rental car while Julian was screaming at his wife inside room 104. Arthur watched the digital map populate on his screen, a pulsing red beacon pinpointing the exact location of the vehicle. The coordinates indicated a desolate, abandoned winter boatyard on the industrial edge of Lake Michigan, an isolated dead zone perfectly suited for an ambush. Julian thought he was setting a brilliant trap, but he had merely broadcast his exact coordinates to the apex predator. Arthur stood up from the leather armchair, leaving the glass of expensive scotch unfinished on the table. The posture of the frail, shuffling basement ghost evaporated entirely, replaced by the towering, unyielding titan of industry who had spent 4 decades crushing hostile corporate takeovers and breaking corrupt union bosses. He walked purposefully into the expansive master suite, ignoring the casual, comfortable clothing he usually wore in isolation. He dressed specifically for war, donning a bespoke, charcoal gray suit tailored perfectly to his broad shoulders, a crisp white shirt, and a heavy, dark wool overcoat that radiated absolute, uncompromising authority. He slipped his feet into polished leather Oxfords, staring at his reflection in the full-length mirror. He was no longer the pathetic old man Julian had mocked at the Oak Room Country Club. He was the founder, the grantor, and the executioner, preparing to deliver the final audit of his son's bankrupt soul. He picked up the secure satellite phone, dialing the direct line to the commander of his Chicago-based extraction team. The orders Arthur issued were cold, precise, and completely devoid of paternal hesitation. He authorized the immediate deployment of 3 heavily armored sport utility vehicles, instructing the operatives to lock down the perimeter of the abandoned boatyard and completely seal off any possible avenue of escape. He explicitly commanded them not to engage Julian physically, insisting that the final confrontation and the safe retrieval of his grandson required his own personal oversight. After terminating the connection, Arthur walked out of the warm lodge and stepped into the freezing Wyoming night, climbing into the back of a waiting transport vehicle that ferried him toward the private, heavily guarded airstrip located just 5 miles down the mountain. The Gulfstream jet was already fueled and waiting on the icy tarmac, its engines whining with a low, powerful intensity as the flight crew prepared for an immediate, unscheduled departure. Arthur boarded the aircraft, his tailored overcoat catching the frigid wind, and took his seat in the luxurious leather cabin as the plane began its rapid ascent into the dark winter sky. He looked out the small window, watching the snow-covered peaks drop away beneath the dense cloud cover, his mind completely focused on the frozen shoreline waiting for him in Chicago. Julian had crossed the ultimate, unforgivable line by weaponizing an innocent child to protect his own pathetic greed. He had attempted to bait a helpless old man into the light, completely unaware that he had just summoned a leviathan from the deep. The flight would take less than 3 hours, and when the armored vehicles finally breached the perimeter of the desolate boatyard, Julian would learn the true meaning of absolute destruction. The abandoned boatyard was a skeletal wasteland of rusted hulls and flapping blue tarpaulins that groaned under the assault of the relentless Lake Michigan gale. Julian sat in the front seat of the idling rental car, his eyes fixed on the entrance to the yard, his hands drumming a frantic, uneven rhythm against the steering wheel. He had been waiting for nearly an hour, his desperation curdling into a jagged, unstable paranoia as the heater in the battered sedan struggled to keep the cabin temperature above freezing. Beside him, Chloe sat in a stony, terrified silence, her eyes darting toward the back seat where Leo lay curled in a tight ball, his face puffy and red from hours of exhausting, forced weeping. Julian checked his phone for the 10th time, wondering why Russo hadn't called or why Vance hadn't responded to the digital ransom note. He was so consumed by his own internal collapse that he failed to notice the 3 massive, blacked-out SUVs that had silently drifted into position, cutting off the only road leading back to the highway. The trap had been sprung, but as the heavy doors of the lead vehicle opened, Julian realized with a jolting shock that he was not the one holding the leash. Arthur Sterling stepped out into the biting cold, his dark wool overcoat swirling around his legs like a shadow. He stood for a long moment, surveying the desolate scene with the clinical detachment of a general inspecting a conquered territory. He did not look like a man who had spent the last 5 years living in a damp basement. He looked like the towering, unyielding titan who had carved an empire out of the Chicago limestone. As he approached the rental car, his footsteps were heavy and rhythmic, crunching deliberately against the frozen gravel. Julian watched his father through the cracked windshield, his mouth hanging open in a silent, horrified gasp. He had expected a broken, pleading old man, a grandfather driven to his knees by the sight of his grandson's tears. Instead, he saw the resurrection of the shark of the Atlantic, a man who radiated a cold, absolute authority that seemed to stop the very wind in its tracks. Julian scrambled to find his door handle, his fingers trembling so violently that he nearly dropped his phone, finally stumbling out into the freezing air to face the ghost he had summoned. "You're late," Julian shouted, his voice cracking and thin as it fought against the roar of the lake. He tried to project a confidence he no longer felt, gesturing wildly toward the car where Leo was now sitting up, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and sudden, desperate hope. Julian barked that Arthur needed to sign the power of attorney documents immediately if he ever wanted to see the boys safe again, threatening to take Leo across state lines where Arthur would never find them. Arthur didn't stop walking until he was mere inches from his son, his presence so suffocatingly large that Julian was forced to step back against the rusted fender of the rental. Arthur did not raise his voice, nor did he display a single flicker of the paternal warmth Julian had spent a lifetime exploiting. He looked at his son with an expression of profound, surgical contempt, his eyes like twin shards of polished flint. He told Julian that he had always known his son was a narcissist and a failure, but he had never truly believed Julian was a coward who would hide behind the tears of a 10-year-old child to save his own bank account. Arthur's voice was a low, steady rumble that vibrated in the frozen air, informing Julian that the game was not just over, it had been fundamentally rigged from the very beginning. He detailed how the private security operatives had tracked Julian from the pawn shop to the motel and finally to the school, documenting every second of the abduction for the authorities. Arthur leaned in closer, his shadow falling over Julian like a burial shroud, and whispered that Julian had made the final, fatal mistake of underestimating the man who had laid the foundations of the city. He wasn't there to negotiate, and he certainly wasn't there to sign over his soul. Arthur turned his back on Julian as if his son were nothing more than a minor environmental nuisance, walking toward the rear door of the sedan. He opened it gently, his face softening for the briefest second as he reached in and pulled a sobbing Leo into a firm, protective embrace. He told the boy that the nightmare was over and that they were going home, his voice carrying a quiet, unshakable promise. Julian stood paralyzed by the side of the car, watching his leverage evaporate into the freezing mist. He looked toward the black SUVs, seeing the silhouettes of the massive enforcers standing ready, their faces masked by the gloom of the winter afternoon. He realized with a sickening lurch of his stomach that he was completely surrounded, not just by physical force, but by the overwhelming weight of the law and the absolute financial ruin his father had orchestrated. Chloe remained frozen in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed forward, already calculating how she might spin this to save her own skin, while Julian was left alone in the cold. Arthur signaled to his men, and two of the large enforcers moved forward to secure the boy, gently leading Leo toward the warmth of the lead SUV. Arthur stayed behind, standing in the center of the boatyard like a monument to justice, watching his son with a gaze that promised no mercy. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant, mournful cry of a freighter's horn out on the lake, signaling the end of the Sterling dynasty. The heavy silence of the boatyard was suddenly shattered by the rising, discordant wail of sirens as Chicago police cruisers and unmarked federal vehicles tore through the perimeter, their flashing blue and red lights dancing frantically against the rusted hulls of the dry-docked yachts. Arthur Sterling stood perfectly still, his hand resting protectively on Leo's shoulder as the authorities flooded the scene, the chaos swirling around him while he remained the calm, immovable center of the storm. Vance had not merely alerted the local precinct, he had delivered a meticulously organized digital mountain of evidence to the district attorney's office hours in advance. As the officers fanned out with practiced precision, Vance stepped out from one of the trailing black SUVs, holding a leather briefcase that contained the final, crushing chapters of Julian and Chloe's downfall. The evidence went far beyond the desperate abduction of the boy, reaching back into 5 years of systemic corporate rot and a brazen embezzlement of trust assets. Julian remained slumped against the fender of the sputtering rental car, his eyes wide and vacant as he watched the tactical teams approach with their weapons drawn low. The arrogance that had sustained him for half a decade had vanished, leaving behind only the hollow, trembling shell of a man who had gambled everything on a lie and lost. One of the lead detectives, a grim-faced man who had seen the worst of the city's greed, stepped toward Julian and informed him that he was being placed under arrest for the kidnapping of a minor, corporate fraud, and multiple counts of grand larceny. Chloe let out a sharp, hysterical shriek from the passenger seat as another officer opened her door, informing her that the forensic audit of her offshore accounts had provided more than enough evidence to charge her with felony embezzlement and conspiracy. As the handcuffs clicked into place with a cold, metallic finality, the weight of their new reality finally shattered Julian's catatonic state. He began to thrash against the officer's grip, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic sob as he turned his desperate gaze toward the father he had so recently called senile and weak. "Dad, please." Julian wailed, the sound echoing miserably across the frozen boatyard as the salt-heavy wind whipped his words away. He begged for mercy, screaming that he was sorry, that the stress of the company had driven him to madness, and that he would do anything to make it right if Arthur would only tell the police it was all a misunderstanding. He looked at Arthur with the same manipulative, watery eyes he had used since he was a child, hoping to find a flicker of the soft-hearted father who had once lived in his basement. But Arthur did not move, and the expression on his face did not soften. He watched as his only son was pushed toward the back of a squad car, his expensive silk shirt torn and his knees covered in the dirty slush of the yard. Julian's frantic pleas became increasingly unhinged as he shouted that he was a sterling, that he was a king, and that he couldn't survive in a cell. Chloe followed him in another set of cuffs, her face a mask of silent, venomous shock as she realized that Marco and the villa in Zurich were now as distant as another galaxy. Arthur walked toward the open door of the police cruiser just before the officer closed it, leaning in so his shadow completely obscured the light in Julian's eyes. He didn't speak with anger or even with the booming authority he had used moments before. Instead, his voice was a low, terrifyingly calm whisper that carried the weight of a final judgment. He looked his son in the eye and reminded him of the night at the Oak Room, of the laughter and the wine, and of the moment Julian had declared that Arthur was nothing more than a drain on his resources. Arthur leaned in closer, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates, and told Julian that he had been right about one thing: the time for wasting money was indeed over. He delivered his final, devastating line with the precision of a surgeon, telling his son that while he had complained about wasting his money, he was now simply wasting Arthur's time. The heavy door of the cruiser slammed shut, cutting off the last of Julian's desperate cries. Arthur stood back as the convoy began to move, the tires of the police vehicles crunching over the frozen gravel as they hauled the two parasites toward a future defined by concrete walls and iron bars. He watched the tail lights fade into the gray Chicago mist, feeling the heavy, suffocating burden of the sterling name finally lift from his shoulders. He turned toward Vance, who was standing quietly by the lead SUV, and gave a single, somber nod. The lawyer signaled the driver, and the remaining vehicles began to idle, their heaters humming as they prepared to transport the founder and his grandson away from the wreckage of the dynasty. Arthur climbed into the back seat where Leo was waiting, wrapped in a thick wool blanket and drinking a cup of warm cocoa provided by one of the security team. As the SUV pulled out of the boatyard and headed toward the private airfield, Arthur looked out at the churning, gray waves of the lake. The audit was complete, the rot had been excised, and for the first time in years, the silence of the winter night felt like a blessing rather than a prison. The roaring winds of Chicago were thousands of miles away, replaced by the deep, soulful crackle of cedar logs burning in a massive stone fireplace. Arthur Sterling sat in his favorite leather armchair, the one that had been moved from his old study to this high mountain sanctuary in Wyoming, watching the golden embers dance against the dark timber walls. Outside the reinforced glass windows, the Teton Range stood like silent sentinels under a blanket of pristine, untouched snow, offering a level of peace Arthur had forgotten existed during his 5 years of basement exile. In the center of the room, nestled on a thick wool rug, Leo was deeply asleep, his breathing steady and rhythmic for the first time since the ordeal at the boatyard. The boy was safe, the nightmares were fading, and the toxic influence of a father who measured love in dollar signs had been permanently excised from his life. Arthur reached out a hand, his fingers grazing the rough texture of a small, framed photograph resting on the side table. It was Eleanor, smiling at a summer gala decades ago, her eyes holding that same piercing intelligence that had foreseen the storm and provided the blueprints for their survival. The fallout from the Eleanor Protocol had been as absolute and devastating as the winter tide. Back in Chicago, the sterling real estate empire was undergoing a radical, surgical purification under Vance's unyielding oversight. The corporate rot Julian had encouraged was being cut away, the toxic assets were being liquidated, and the Lake Forest mansion had been sold to a historical preservation society, its halls no longer echoing with Chloe's entitled shrieks. Julian and Chloe were currently navigating the stark, unfeeling bureaucracy of the Cook County justice system, their days defined by fluorescent lights and the grueling reality of a public defender who had no time for their delusions of grandeur. The news of the billionaire kidnapping had saturated the headlines for a week before flickering out, leaving the couple to face the long, silent consequence of their choices in total obscurity. Arthur felt no joy in their suffering, nor did he harbor any desire for further retribution. He simply felt the profound, quiet relief of a man who had finally finished a long and bitter day of labor. Arthur reached into the inner pocket of his cardigan and pulled out the 1928 silver certificate. It was heavily creased, its edges softened by wine and slush, and held together by a single, thin strip of archival tape where Julian had tried to rend it into nothingness. To the rest of the world, it was an obsolete scrap of paper, worth barely $50 in a collector's shop. To Arthur, it was the most valuable asset he owned, a physical manifestation of Eleanor's wisdom and a reminder that true value was not found in what was spent, but in what was preserved. He leaned forward, placing the certificate on the mantel of the fireplace, right next to a small wooden carving Leo had made earlier that afternoon. The contrast was beautiful and grounding, a bridge between a legacy saved and a future just beginning to take root. Arthur realized then that he had not just destroyed a poisoned empire, he had reclaimed the right to be a grandfather, to be a teacher, and to be a man whose words still carried the weight of iron. As the fire began to settle into a soft, glowing bed of coals, Arthur felt the last lingering tension leave his shoulders. He looked at his grandson, the only heir who truly mattered now, and felt a surge of quiet, fierce pride. Leo would grow up here, far from the suffocating vanity of the country clubs and the glass towers. He would learn the value of hard work, the necessity of patience, and the immutable strength found in silence. Arthur closed his eyes, the steady hum of the mountain night filling the room with a sense of completion. He had played the role of the victim, he had navigated the shadows as a ghost, and he had returned as the architect to deliver justice. The sterling name would no longer be a synonym for greed or arrogance, it would be a testament to a foundation that held firm against the most personal of betrayals. In the deep, restorative silence of the lodge, Arthur Sterling finally allowed himself to rest, knowing that the guardian ghost had finished its work and that the house he had built was, at last, truly at peace.